In 1823, according to legend, a schoolboy picked up a football and ran with it and accidentally invented an entirely new sport. But here's the thing, historians think that story is almost completely made up. So who actually invented rugby? The answer involves a myth, a forgotten schoolboy, a pub argument, and a 100-year fight over money. Rugby, Warwickshire, England. November 1823. A group of boys at rugby school are playing football, the old medieval kind, with kicking, shoving, and almost no rules. And then, allegedly, a boy named William Webb Ellis does something no one has done before. He catches the ball and instead of kicking it, he tucks it under his arm and runs. So who was this William Webb Ellis? His father was a soldier who died in the Peninsular War when William was just 6. His mother moved the family to Rugby because anyone living within 10 miles of the town clock got a free education at rugby school. William was smart, he later went to Oxford, became a Church of England clergyman, played cricket for Oxford, and gave a famous sermon about the Crimean War. He never not once mentioned anything about picking up a ball and running with it. Webb Ellis died in 1872 in France. 4 years later, 4 years after he couldn't deny anything, a man named Matthew Bloxham, who had also attended rugby school decades earlier, wrote a letter to the school magazine. He said he'd heard from an unnamed source that a boy called Ellis had once picked up the ball and run with it. The only source for rugby's entire origin story is a single letter, from a man, about what an unnamed person told him, about something that may have happened 50 years earlier. In 1895, the Old Rugbyian Society and alumni group launched an official investigation into the Webb Ellis story. They interviewed everyone who had been at rugby school in the relevant era. The results were not encouraging for the myth. One witness, Thomas Harris, remembered Webb Ellis perfectly and described him as, quote, inclined to take unfair advantages at sports. In other words, a known cheat. The committee concluded that running with the ball had developed gradually through the 1830s, years after Webb Ellis had already left the school. The investigation did point to a more likely candidate, a boy named Jem Mackey. Mackey popularized running with the ball at rugby school in the late 1830s, and his innovation was officially written into the school's rules in 1841. But Mackey had a problem, he'd been expelled from rugby school for bad behavior. So when the rugby establishment needed a wholesome origin story, a respectable clergyman like Webb Ellis was a far more convenient hero than a boy who'd been kicked out of school. Here's what we do know for certain. Rugby school had been playing its own chaotic version of football for generations. Unlike other schools, rugby's game allowed catching the ball and in 1841, running with it. In 1845, 3 pupils named William Delafield Arnold, Walron Shirley, and Frederick Hutchins sat down and wrote the very first formal rules of rugby football, the oldest written rules of any modern football code. Not Webb Ellis. 3 15-year-old boys with a pen and some paper. Rugby school's rules spread to other clubs and schools across England. By 1863, there were dozens of clubs playing different versions of football, and things were getting confusing. That year, representatives met at the Freemasons' Tavern in London to agree on a single unified set of rules. But one question tore the meeting apart: can you pick up the ball and run with it? One club, Blackheath FC, said yes. They stormed out when the majority voted no. Blackheath's side became rugby. The kicking-only side became soccer. Blackheath and the rugby-style clubs needed their own governing body. In January 1871, 21 clubs met in London, reportedly after a Richmond player was killed in a match, prompting urgent calls for proper rules. That meeting founded the Rugby Football Union, the RFU. 3 lawyers who were rugby school alumni drew up the first official laws of the game. And on March 27, 1871, Scotland beat England in the very first international rugby match, played in Edinburgh. Scotland won. England had just created a sport and immediately lost at it. Rugby spread through the British Empire the same way football did, through sailors, soldiers, merchants, and teachers. New Zealand got it in 1870. South Africa in the 1870s. Australia formed its first rugby union in 1874. France picked it up from British students in Paris in the 1870s. By the 1880s, the British and Irish Lions were touring the world, the first international sporting tour in any sport. Rugby had gone from a muddy school field in Warwickshire to 5 continents in under 40 years. But by the 1890s, rugby had a serious problem, and it was about money. The RFU had one strict rule: rugby must be amateur. No player could be paid. That was fine for wealthy southern English clubs, whose players had money and flexible working hours. But in the north of England, Yorkshire, Lancashire, most rugby players were working class. A Saturday match meant a day off work. A day off work meant lost wages. When northern clubs asked the RFU to allow broken time payments, compensation for wages lost to play rugby, the RFU refused. On August 29, 1895, 21 clubs from Northern England walked out of the Rugby Football Union and met at the George Hotel in Huddersfield to form the Northern Rugby Football Union. This became Rugby League, the world's first football code to go professional and pay players. The two sports, Rugby Union and Rugby League, diverged from that moment. League reduced teams to 13 players, removed lineouts, introduced the six-tackle rule, and became faster and more spectator-friendly. Union kept 15 players, kept the scrums and lineouts, and stayed strictly amateur for another 100 years. Rugby Union remained strictly amateur for exactly 100 years. Players who accepted any money, even expenses, risked lifetime bans. Meanwhile, Rugby League grew into a massive professional sport, particularly in Australia, England, and Papua New Guinea. The world's best rugby union players played for glory in their country and nothing else. That finally changed in 1995, when the Rugby World Cup was held in South Africa. Nelson Mandela wore a Springboks jersey. South Africa won. And that same year, the International Rugby Board declared the game open. Professional players could now be paid. Rugby Union had finally caught up with the 1895 Northern clubs it had expelled a century earlier. Rugby Union remained strictly amateur for exactly 100 years. Players who accepted any. So, who invented rugby? Not William Webb Ellis. Almost certainly not. The sport was invented by generations of schoolboys at rugby school, codified in 1845 by 3 teenage pupils, split from football at a London pub in 1863, given a governing body in 1871, torn apart by a class war in 1895, and turned professional in 1995. No single person. No single moment. Just a long, messy, very British argument about whether you're allowed to pick up the ball. And somehow, out of all that chaos, a sport that's now played in over 120 countries. The Webb Ellis Cup, the Rugby World Cup trophy, is still named after the man who probably had nothing to do with any of it.